UFC 206 had been criticized for its lack of star power, but at least it had a championship headlining act to fall back on. But that's no longer the case, as light heavyweight title holder Daniel Cormier was forced to withdraw from the event with a groin injury. Just when it seemed UFC 206 was being transformed from an average card to a solid one, the promotion's final Canada show for 2016 reportedly has lost its scheduled headliner. UFC light heavyweight champion Daniel Cormier, 18-1 MMA, 7-1 UFC, has suffered an injury that will prevent him from defending his title against Anthony Johnson, 22-5 MMA, 13-5 UFC, on the December 10 fight card at Air Canada Centre in Toronto. The main card airs on pay-per-view following prelims on FS1 and UFC Fight Pass. UFC officials have not yet made a formal announcement of Cormier's withdrawal. Johnson, however, tweeted an acknowledgement of the reported injury and said he wishes him a full recovery. Cormier tweeted an acknowledgement of the injury at Johnson, as well. MaFighting.com first reported the scrapped title fight. This is the second time in 2016 that Cormier has withdrawn from a title defense. He was forced out of a title unification bout with Jon Jones back at UFC 197 in April. Jones fought Ovince Saint Preux instead at the event, winning a 5-round decision, and Cormier-Jones was scheduled to headline July's UFC 200. Unfortunately for fight fans, Jones failed a drug test and was suspended, so Cormier picked up a unanimous decision victory over short-notice opponent Anderson Silva at the event. Jones' subsequent suspension paved the way for an anticipated Cormier-Johnson rematch. The two previously fought for the vacant 205-pound title back at UFC 187 last May. Cormier submitted Johnson with a rear-naked choke in the third round to win the belt. UFC 206's co-main event, a featherweight showdown between rising star Max Holloway and former lightweight champ Anthony Pettis, was promoted to the main event. Donald Cerrone vs. Matt Brown was recently added to the Air Canada Centre event. Cerrone was set to take on Kelvin Gastelum at UFC 205, but that fight never materialized because Gastelum failed to make weight. Rashad Evans vs. Tim Kennedy, also scheduled to take place at UFC 205, was bumped to UFC 206 after Evans was not given clearance to compete by New York's Athletic Commission. However, the Ontario Athletic Commission followed in New York's footsteps and didn't give Evans clearance, so the UFC is currently seeking an opponent for Kennedy. Ariel Helwani reported the UFC was hoping to have Kennedy fight Gastelum in a middleweight contest. Cormier, number 2 in the latest USA Today Sports, Imaging Key MMA light heavyweight rankings, was to attempt to defend the 205-pound belt against Johnson in a rematch of a May 2015 bout at UFC 187. DC won that fight by third-round submission, capturing the then-vacant belt left behind when former champ Jon Jones was stripped and suspended for his involvement in a hit-and-run accident. After making his first defense against Alexander Gustafsson at UFC 192 in October, Cormier was scheduled to rematch Jones in July's UFC 200 headliner. The fight fell apart just days out, though, and Cormier ended up fighting and beating former UFC middleweight champion Anderson Silva in a short-notice affair. The extent of Cormier's injury remains to be seen, but the UFC 206 withdrawal marks the second time this year that he's been forced to pull out of a scheduled title fight. Number 3 ranked Johnson, meanwhile, has rattled off 3 consecutive victories since losing to Cormier at UFC 187, all in dominant fashion, to help him earn a second chance at becoming the UFC title holder. Rumble has steamrolled the competition, scoring 3 straight knockouts of Jimmy Manuwa, Ryan Bader, and most recently, a 13-second finish of Glover Teixeira at UFC 202 in August. Johnson still may compete at UFC 206. However, it's unknown what potential opponents could step in on only 2 weeks' notice. The UFC 206 card now includes Anthony Johnson vs. DBA, Max Holloway vs. Anthony Pettis, Matt Brown vs. Donald Cerrone, Rashad Evans vs. Tim Kennedy. Da-Oh Choi vs. Cub Swanson. Misha Cirkunov vs. Nikita Krylov. Olivier Albin Mercier vs. Drew Dober. Valerie Letourneau vs. Viviane Pereira. John Makdessi vs. Lando Vannata. Rustam Khabilov vs. Jason Sago. Mitch Gagnon vs. Matthew Lopez. Zach Makovsky vs. Dustin Ortiz. Emil Meek vs. Jordan Mine.